The summer of 1976 smothered Pine Grove, Oregon, in a heat unlike anything locals could remember. The bicentennial banners still clung to storefronts, their colors faded and drooping, like tired reminders of national pride already past. The logging town was normally quiet, a rhythm of chainsaws, sawdust, and the occasional timber truck rattling down Route 47. But that July, the air hung thick and restless, as if nature itself had paused to watch something approach. Patricia Miller sat on the porch of the Pine Grove Inn, sipping coffee that had grown lukewarm in the mug. She had been running the inn for nearly a decade, and mornings were usually predictable: an older couple checking out, a traveling salesman wanting a packed lunch for the road. Outsiders were rare, and she noted every detail when they did arrive. So when the cream-colored Cadillac Eldorado purred into the gravel lot, dust blooming in the heat, Patricia leaned forward. The Illinois plate gleamed beneath the Sunday out of state. That was unusual. She made a mental note, something to mention to Sheriff Dawson during his afternoon coffee visit. The Cadillac's doors opened in near-perfect symmetry, and two young women stepped out as if rehearsed. Their dresses were pale blue, cardigans draped neatly over their shoulders despite the suffocating warmth. Copper hair caught the sun, feathered into matching cuts that framed delicate faces. To Patricia, they looked like they had stepped straight from the glossy covers of the magazines, stacked by the checkout stand at the general store, too flawless, almost staged. The taller one approached with a smile so warm it almost disarmed Patricia. "Good morning. I'm Elizabeth Crowley, and this is my sister, Catherine. We have a reservation for the honeymoon suite." Patricia opened her worn, leather-bound reservation book. Indeed, the Crowley name was there, written in the neat block letters she remembered from the phone call weeks earlier. "Of course, Mrs. Crowley. And where are your husbands?" Elizabeth's smile didn't falter. If anything, it held steady with unnerving calm. "They'll be arriving later today, business in Portland. We thought we'd get settled in first." Patricia nodded, though something about the answer felt rehearsed, like dialogue from a play. The sisters handed her crisp $20 bills, peeling them from a thick envelope with methodical care. They carried matching Samsonite luggage, polished, unscuffed, and climbed the narrow stairs to the inn's most expensive room, the honeymoon suite. A four-poster bed, mountain view, the kind of place where new lives began. For 2 weeks, Patricia watched them in glimpses, a figure on the porch at dusk, the pair leaving for walks in the evening heat, always side by side, moving with uncanny synchronicity. They rarely spoke with other guests, and Patricia never once saw the supposed husbands arrive. On August 1st, when the Crowley sisters checked out, Patricia entered the honeymoon suite with fresh linens draped over her arm. She stopped at the threshold. The room was immaculate, eerily so. The sheets barely wrinkled, not a hair in the drain, not a fingerprint on the mirror. It was as though no one had stayed there at all. Patricia later told investigators it was the cleanest room she had ever seen after guests departed. At the time, though, she simply felt a chill despite the heat pressing at the windows. She closed the door softly behind her, as though not to disturb whatever absence lingered there. 3 days later, 57 miles away, the river would give up its first secret. On the evening of August 4th, 1976, a group of teenagers gathered by the Willamette River. They'd brought cheap beer, a portable radio, and the restless energy that comes from a summer with too little to do. The water was low, exposing sandbars and fallen logs that jutted like skeletal arms. The air smelled of algae and warm stone. It should have been an ordinary night: music, laughter, and the hum of insects. 17-year-old Bobby Thompson wandered from the group, his sneakers crunching over damp riverbank stones. Something pale and swollen had snagged against a driftwood trunk, half submerged in the slow current. At first he thought it was an animal, maybe a deer carcass, but as he moved closer, the truth rose up through the haze of heat and beer. It was human, a torso. Bobby staggered backward, bile burning his throat. The flesh was bloated, decomposed, stripped of limbs and head. But it wasn't just the mutilation that seared itself into his memory, it was the deliberate precision. The wounds didn't look ragged or accidental. They looked cut, surgical. Near the body, a plastic bag bobbed in the current, snagged on a root. Bobby, trembling, used a stick to drag it ashore. Inside, a wallet, car keys, and a wedding ring still glinting through the murky water. The identification card bore the name James Harrison, age 35, a banker from Chicago. The teenagers fled to the nearest gas station payphone, and within 20 minutes, Sheriff Walter Dawson was at the scene. He had served Pine Grove for 20 years, most of it spent chasing down stolen logging equipment, bar fights, and the occasional drunk driver. What lay in the mud by the riverbank was something else entirely. Dawson crouched, his face shadowed beneath the brim of his hat. He didn't speak for a long time. Then he stood, voice low and grim. "We're going to need to search the whole river." Yellow police tape unfurled in the heavy evening air. Reporters hadn't yet arrived, but already whispers spread. A body in the water, mutilated, a stranger from far away. Dr. Morris, the county coroner, arrived in his station wagon, medical bag tucked under his arm. His preliminary examination was clinical but chilling. Male, between 30 and 40 years old, dead at least 2 weeks. And Walter? He lowered his voice, though the teenagers still hovering nearby would never forget the words. The genitals have been surgically removed. Over the next 72 hours, as search crews combed the Willamette, more fragments surfaced, 4 more torsos, all showing the same precise mutilation. With each find came another plastic bag, and with each bag another name. Thomas Miller, age 38. William Peterson, age 43. Robert Johnson, age 36. Every wallet carried the polished identity of success. Businessmen from Chicago, men with good suits, gold watches, and families who expected them home. Every one of them had been recently married. Every one of them had vanished without a trace. The small logging town had never seen anything like it. State police joined, setting up makeshift tents by the riverbank. Flashbulbs popped as photographs were taken. Deputies slogged through waist-deep water, nets dragging the current. By night, portable lamps lit the mudbanks in harsh white glare, turning the river into a stage where horror played out piece by piece. The bodies were not just dumped, they were presented. Whoever had done this wanted the victims to be found. The surgical cuts spoke of control, of method. It wasn't rage, it was ritual. And back at the Pine Grove Inn, the reservation book still carried 2 sets of fingerprints pressed faintly into its pages. The Crowley Sisters had written their names into the ledger of Pine Grove and into the ledger of death. The Willamette yielded its grim tally, but the most chilling revelation came not from the river, it came from ink and fingerprints on paper. Inside the Pine Grove Inn's reservation book, investigators lifted partial prints from the neat block letters that spelled out Elizabeth Crowley and Catherine Crowley. When those prints were compared against the smudged impressions left on the plastic bags recovered with the bodies, the match was undeniable. The women who had smiled so politely at Patricia Miller were now tethered directly to the corpses washing ashore. For the first time, names had faces. Elizabeth, 24, Catherine, 22, both red-haired, soft-featured, nearly interchangeable in appearance. On the surface, they looked like daughters any parent would trust, women who could have graced television sitcoms or glossy detergent commercials. But beneath that wholesome veneer lay something else, something methodical, predatory. The investigation widened, stretching far beyond Oregon. Phone calls crackled across long-distance lines to Illinois, where Chicago police began combing through missing persons reports. The pattern emerged quickly, chilling in its precision. Each victim, a recently married businessman. Each honeymoon supposedly destined for the Pacific Northwest. Each disappearance neatly coinciding with the Crowley Sisters' movements. This wasn't coincidence. This was choreography. Newspapers latched onto the story, branding it with the kind of phrase designed to sell headlines, the honeymoon killings. For Pine Grove, the small town suddenly became the center of a nationwide spectacle. Television anchors spoke the sisters' names with a mix of disbelief and fascination. 2 young women, beautiful and seemingly innocent, now branded as predators who hunted husbands. Sheriff Walter Dawson, a man who had built his career on the routine problems of a logging town, found himself at the head of Oregon's first serial killer investigation. He commandeered the Pine Grove Town Hall, transforming it into a war room. The walls filled with black and white photographs, maps dotted with pins marking discovery sites, and notes scribbled on yellow legal pads. But for all the flurry of activity, the investigation was hobbled by the limitations of the 1,970 seconds. Fingerprint comparison meant men hunched over magnifying glasses, matching ridges by eye. Records were filed in steel cabinets, not databases. Witness statements were typed on ribbon-fed machines, errors corrected with messy streaks of whiteout. Even with those limitations, a disturbing profile was taking shape. The sisters were not killing for money alone, though cash was always part of the pattern. They married quickly, almost in secret. Without family or friends present, they paid for honeymoons in advance, always in cash, leaving no paper trail. And when their victims vanished, the women themselves dissolved into the background, reappearing only when another husband disappeared. Locals were stunned. Patricia Miller replayed every moment of the sisters' stay at the inn, their quiet walks, their neatness, their smiles. She realized that even then something about them had unsettled her. Not what they did, but how they did it. The order, the sameness. As if everything about their lives was rehearsed, practiced, stripped of spontaneity. In an era when the public imagination was still reeling from names like Charles Manson and the Zodiac, the idea of 2 young women orchestrating such horrors cut against every cultural assumption. Killers were supposed to be men, driven by rage or lust. But Elizabeth and Catherine Crowley had written a new script, one in which femininity itself was a mask, concealing a predator who didn't need brute strength to destroy. For Sheriff Dawson, that mask was now his enemy. And for the first time in his career, he faced the chilling truth. The danger hadn't come from a drifter, an ex-convict, or an unstable logger. It had walked into Pine Grove smiling, with polished luggage and crisp $20 bills. The call came from Chicago in late August 1976. Detective Sam Ramirez's voice crackled over the long-distance line to Lieutenant Frank Richards of the Oregon State Police. "We found their apartment," Ramirez said. "Frank, you're not going to believe this." Inside a modest Chicago walk-up, police uncovered a chamber of horrors disguised as a home. In the kitchen, the table was covered in plastic sheeting, a makeshift operating surface. On it lay surgical instruments, scalpels, clamps, bone saws arranged in precise order, gleaming under the harsh light. Polaroids were pinned to the wall, showing smiling men before and mutilated torsos after. Some images were neatly labeled with dates and initials, as if part of an organized archive. Ramirez flipped through a stack of photographs, his hand trembling. "They documented everything," he muttered. In a drawer, detectives found a typewritten manifesto 47 pages long. Its pages were filled with meticulous justifications, diatribes against male power, scorn for fathers, priests, and husbands. One phrase repeated throughout: "They deserve correction." There were passages describing surgical techniques in chilling clinical detail, and woven between the pages was rage, raw and festering, and anger clearly rooted in the sisters' past. Even more disturbing were the souvenirs. Glass jars lined a cabinet, each containing preserved fragments. The macabre trophies were labeled in the same careful typewritten font, as though the Crowley sisters had curated a museum of vengeance. For Richards and Dawson, the pieces clicked into place. The sisters weren't opportunistic killers. They were ritualists. Their crimes weren't random acts of violence, but rehearsed performances, staged with surgical precision. Each man chosen, each wound deliberate. By October, 2 more mutilated bodies were discovered in remote Oregon clearings, pushing the tally to 7. The cuts matched. The plastic bags were the same. The pattern was undeniable. Reporters descended on Pine Grove, turning the sleepy logging town into a media storm. Headlines screamed, "The Honeymoon killers strike again." Nightly broadcasts speculated wildly, were the sisters part of a cult? Were they political radicals, feminist avengers? Sheriff Dawson could barely contain his frustration. Behind the closed doors of the town hall command center, maps were layered with pins, notes strung together with red thread. He smoked so much the walls yellowed. Yet every lead collapsed. The Crowley's Cadillac was found abandoned at Portland International Airport. Its interior had been scrubbed so clean it gleamed, stripped of even a single fingerprint. Flight manifests showed no passengers resembling the sisters, no train tickets, no bus stubs. It was as though the earth itself had swallowed them. Investigators looked back into their origins. The sisters' Kentucky hometown produced little more than whispers. Their parents, dead in a suspicious house fire. Former neighbors who recalled them as inseparable, odd, polite, and always together, whispering in corners. Girls who smiled but never laughed. The fire, the manifesto, the surgical rituals, it all hinted at a darker seed planted years before. But what terrified investigators most was not what they understood, it was what they didn't. 2 young women, armed not with brute force but with cunning and precision, had outmaneuvered every system designed to catch them. By the end of 1976, Elizabeth and Catherine Crowley were ghosts. Only their photographs remained, 2 red-haired women with soft smiles pinned to post office walls and flashed across television screens. America's first female serial killers of such scale, and already they had vanished into myth. By late autumn of 1976, the Crowley sisters had evaporated from the map. What they left behind were fragments, fingerprints, Polaroids, a manifesto dripping with rage, but no bodies to prosecute, no suspects to bring into custody. Their Cadillac Eldorado, once a symbol of their arrival, sat abandoned at Portland International Airport. Investigators combed every inch: trunk, upholstery, engine block. The car was spotless, stripped of fingerprints, hair, fibers, anything that could tie it to its passengers. The sisters had wiped it with meticulous care, as if rehearsed for years. Flight manifests showed no trace of them. They hadn't boarded any commercial airline under their names or under any obvious alias. Train stations were checked, bus depots scoured. Nothing. It was as though the women had walked off the face of the earth. Sheriff Walter Dawson, normally a calm and steady man, began to fray at the edges. He set up his command post in Pine Grove Town Hall, its paneled walls soon layered with photographs, fingerprints, and maps dotted with pins. Every night he sat in the haze of his own cigarette smoke, the hum of a desk fan and the steady clack of his typewriter his only companions. His wife would later say he started smoking 2 packs of Marlboros a day, his nerves devoured by the ghosts of 2 women he could never catch. The investigation turned backward, digging into the sisters' past. Kentucky records showed the Crowleys had been born in a small town along the Ohio River. But beyond that, the trail was fog. Their parents had died in a house fire when the girls were still teenagers, officially ruled accidental, though some whispered it had been set deliberately. Neighbors described them as inseparable, polite, but strange. They kept to themselves, one remembered, always together, never apart, like two halves of the same shadow. That was all the past offered suggestions, not answers. And the present was silence. By 1977, the leads dwindled. By 1978, even the reporters left Pine Grove, chasing fresher tragedies. The Honeymoon killings slipped from the headlines into the dark archives of unsolved American crime. Still, Dawson refused to let go. He boxed the files meticulously, photographs curling at the edges, typewritten reports stacked in manila folders, fingerprints smudged onto yellowing cards. He wrote Crowley case in thick black marker on cardboard lids, his handwriting jagged with exhaustion. The boxes were placed in the police department basement, next to logging theft reports and petty burglary files. But Dawson visited them often, as if the paper itself might one day speak. Time, however, was an enemy he couldn't fight. In 1987, a small electrical fire broke out in the basement storage. The sprinklers saved the building but soaked through dozens of evidence boxes. Some photos bled into illegibility. Witness statements blurred into smudges. A handful of artifacts were lost forever. The Crowley evidence survived, mostly, but water stained the paper, and mildew crept into the edges. Preservation in a small-town department was no match for the rot of time. To the families back in Chicago, silence was unbearable. Wives left with wedding rings but no husbands, children left with photographs but no fathers. Each year they called Pine Grove hoping for news. Each year Dawson gave the same answer: "We're still looking." But hope, like evidence, erodes. By the dawn of the 1980s, the sisters had achieved something few killers ever could. They hadn't just taken lives, they had taken certainty itself. They had become phantoms, whispered about in bars, invoked in warnings. The red-haired women who smiled, who vanished, who never came back. For Dawson, the case was no longer professional. It was personal. His colleagues noticed it in the way his hand lingered over their photographs, in the way he muttered their names under his breath. The Crowleys had burrowed into him like a splinter that would never be removed. The truth was simple, brutal, and maddening. Two young women had outwitted an entire nation's law enforcement system, and no one could say where they had gone. As the 1980s dawned, Pine Grove tried to move on. The town returned to its ordinary rhythms: chainsaws in the hills, trucks along Route 47, Sunday church bells. But beneath that surface calm, the murders festered like a scar. The Pine Grove Inn, where the sisters had stayed in the honeymoon suite, closed its doors in 1994 and was eventually converted into apartments. Locals whispered about that upstairs room, the bed where no one had slept, the spotless bathroom. It became the stuff of cautionary tales, told to newcomers by bartenders and gas station clerks. That's where the killers stayed, two women. Nobody ever found them. For the families in Chicago, moving on was impossible. James Harrison's widow, Margaret, never remarried. Each anniversary, she placed a classified ad in the Chicago Tribune. "James, still waiting for answers, still missing you. Love, Margaret." She kept every article about the case in a manila folder tucked into her nightstand. William Peterson's son, Michael, grew up with a black and white wedding photo staring down from the living room wall. His mother kept a shrine, cufflinks, a business section clipping celebrating his father's investment strategy, a folded flag from his high school football days. Each night before bed, Michael touched the photograph and whispered goodnight to the father he never knew. Thomas Miller's mother never held a funeral. She kept his bedroom frozen in time clothes in the drawers, books on the nightstand. When she died in 1995, her relatives discovered shoeboxes under the bed filled with hundreds of letters written to her missing son. None had been mailed. She had lived the rest of her life waiting for a knock on the door that never came. Robert Johnson's brother carried his grief into action. He became a police officer, then a detective, his career driven by one obsession: finding what others had missed. Every summer, he traveled west to Pine Grove, poring over the old case files in the basement, staring at the same yellowed fingerprint cards Dawson had once held. He found no answers, but he refused to stop. Meanwhile, Sheriff Dawson himself retired in 1984. He and his wife moved to Arizona, yet the Crowley sisters came with him in spirit. He called the Pine Grove department monthly, asking for updates that never came. His wife said he kept the sisters' photographs in his desk drawer until his death in 2001. At his funeral, colleagues whispered they got under his skin. He never let them go. Public attention dwindled as years passed. By the late 80s, the Honeymoon killings were reduced to short anniversary blurbs buried in the back pages of newspapers. By the 90s, they disappeared altogether. True crime books surged in popularity, but only one title mentioned the Crowley sisters in depth: a 1992 book that coolly concluded they were likely dead or in hiding overseas. The author called it the perfect crime. But for the families, there was nothing perfect, only absence. The silence gnawed. They gathered each year for memorial services in Chicago, dwindling in attendance as grief scattered families across generations. In the early years, dozens came friends, colleagues, neighbors. By the end of the decade, only the immediate family remained. Pine Grove itself shifted with the times. The logging industry shrank. Young people left for Portland or beyond. The town became quieter, older, more brittle. Yet the story of the Redhead sisters lingered like folklore. A new generation grew up hearing warnings whispered by their parents. Don't trust strangers. Remember what happened here once. On the far bank of the Willamette River, where Bobby Thompson had discovered the first torso, the trees grew thick again, but the ground still felt different. Locals avoided fishing there, saying the water carried bad luck. Bobby himself moved to Seattle and never once spoke of what he had seen. When journalists tracked him down in the 90 seconds, he refused interviews. "It's not my story to tell," he muttered, shutting the door. For law enforcement, the case files gathered dust. Photographs curled at the edges, typewritten reports faded, reel-to-reel interview tapes warped. Time was erasing the details faster than memory. The Crowley sisters had done more than murder 7 men. They had murdered certainty itself. They had stolen futures, fractured families, and left behind a silence that stretched, not for months, but for decades. And by the late 1990 seconds, their story was less a case than a myth, a whispered reminder that evil can wear a smile, check into a small-town inn, and vanish without a trace. It was March of 2014 when a cardboard box arrived at the Oregon State Police Crime Lab in Salem. At first glance, it looked ordinary, just another piece of evidence shuffled across the country. But the return address stopped Detective Marion Harper cold. A storage facility in Tucson, Arizona. Inside the box were 3 items: a VHS tape, a typewritten letter, a small black notebook with the words "Keep Forever" written neatly on its cover. The letter explained that the box had been discovered after payments on a storage unit lapsed. The unit had been rented continuously since 1977 by a woman named Elizabeth Crowley until her death in 2013. For nearly 4 decades, the fees had been paid automatically year after year, hiding the fact that one of America's most wanted women had been living quietly in Arizona. Detective Harper fed the VHS tape into an aging player, the kind long retired from evidence rooms but still kept in a back closet. The screen flickered, static bleeding into focus, and then there they were, Elizabeth and Catherine Crowley, sitting side by side on a floral print couch, like sisters home for Christmas. The recording was dated the 25th of December 1976, just months after their murders in Oregon. For 93 minutes, the sisters calmly, almost serenely, detailed their crimes. They spoke about how they selected their victims, how they performed their surgeries, how they disposed of the bodies. There was no shame, no hesitation. Elizabeth's voice was cool, measured. "We are recording this because someday the world should know the truth. The men we married deserved their fate. All men who abuse power deserve the same." The black notebook offered even more. Its pages were filled with newspaper clippings, photographs, and handwritten entries. Each entry corresponded to a victim, names, dates, methods, but there were more entries than investigators expected. The total victims weren't 7, they were 9. 2 men had never been found. Even more disturbing, the later pages hinted at the sisters' childhood. Notes about their father, the deacon, the monster, about their mother, who looked away, about the house fire, which, the notebook implied, had been no accident. The Crowleys had burned their past to the ground before they ever spilled a drop of anyone else's blood. Detective Harper closed the notebook and sat in silence. The answers that had eluded investigators for nearly 4 decades had finally emerged, but they carried a new burden. If the notebook and letter were true, then Catherine had died of breast cancer in 1993, and Elizabeth had lived on for another 20 years, finally succumbing to heart failure in 2013. Both had escaped the courtroom. Both had evaded justice. But for the first time, the truth had a voice. A recorded confession, a ledger of murder, proof that the monsters of Pine Grove had not disappeared, they had simply grown old under different names. The case was no longer cold, it was burning again. Detective Marion Harper refused to let the VHS tape and black notebook stand as the sisters' final word. "They don't get to control the narrative," she told her team. "We will." The first step was to resurrect the case from paper and dust. Yellowed fingerprint cards were scanned into AFIS, the automated fingerprint identification system that hadn't existed in 1976. Faded photographs were digitally enhanced, sharpening faces that had blurred with time. The fragile VHS confession was converted to digital, allowing analysts to clean the audio, revealing faint background noises, the ticking of a clock, the hiss of a heater, a muffled Christmas carol playing on a radio. Every detail mattered. Technicians examined the typewritten manifesto found in the Chicago apartment nearly 40 years earlier, comparing its linguistic quirks and formatting to the typewritten letter, enclosed with the storage box. Modern stylometric analysis confirmed it. The same hand had typed both. Elizabeth's voice reached across decades in the form of repeated phrasing, idiosyncratic punctuation, and even consistent spelling errors. But the most crucial breakthrough came from DNA. Investigators carefully reopened the original plastic bags that had once held the victims' belongings. To the naked eye, they looked like ordinary evidence degraded by time. Yet with 21st century technology, even a few microscopic skin cells could speak volumes. Swabs revealed trace DNA, skin flakes, sweat, maybe hair fragments that had lingered invisibly since 1976. The profiles matched the samples found in the Tucson storage unit. The Crowley's ghosts were no longer theoretical. They were scientifically verified. The notebook itself named their aliases. Elizabeth had lived as Susan Mitchell, Catherine as Karen Mitchell. The trail led to Arizona, where public records showed 2 women by those names had lived in the Tucson suburbs since the late 1972. They had bought a modest house together. Neighbors remembered them as polite, private, and unremarkable. Church ladies, one neighbor recalled. They volunteered at the animal shelter sometimes, nice enough but quiet. Digging deeper, the team uncovered more. Catherine Karen Mitchell had worked as a nurse at a local clinic until cancer overtook her in 1993. Elizabeth Susan Mitchell had taken a job as a bookkeeper for a small accounting firm, working there quietly until her death in 2013. No friends, no boyfriends, no husbands, just 2 women who faded into the fabric of ordinary life, invisible in their banality. Hospital records confirmed the death of Karen Mitchell from breast cancer. A death certificate listed complications from metastatic disease. Cremation, ashes scattered in the desert. Elizabeth's death certificate, issued in 2013, described heart failure at age 61. She, too, had been cremated. DNA testing of personal items recovered from Susan Mitchell's apartment: hair from a brush, saliva from a toothbrush, confirmed beyond doubt. Susan was Elizabeth Crowley. A strand of hair Catherine had left behind, kept by her sister for 20 years, confirmed she was Catherine. The Crowley sisters had not been hunted down, arrested, or tried. They had slipped into new skins, grown old, and died quietly while the families of their victims endured decades of silence. Yet the investigation revealed something darker still. The final entries in the black notebook made it clear. They never regretted what they had done. Weeks before her death, Elizabeth had scrawled, "We did what was necessary. History will understand, even if the present never did." For Harper and her team, the revelation was both victory and defeat. The mystery was solved, but justice had been denied. The killers had written their own epitaphs and slipped away before the world could confront them. And yet, by dragging their true identities into the light, Harper had ensured the sisters would never vanish again. In June 2014, Detective Marion Harper traveled to Chicago with a briefcase full of answers. Inside were digitized case files, photographs of the sisters in their later years, and the black notebook that had turned myth into history. She had spent weeks preparing, knowing that what she carried was not closure, it was a wound freshly cut open. The families gathered in a quiet community hall, folding chairs, a pot of coffee, the faint smell of dust. They had lived with absence for nearly 40 years. Some had aged into frailty. Others had been children in 1976, now middle-aged, carrying the weight of never knowing. Harper began carefully. She described the storage unit, the VHS confession, the aliases in Arizona. She laid out how Elizabeth had died in 2013, Catherine decades earlier. She explained the DNA matches. The false lives lived in obscurity. Her voice was steady, but her words pressed like stones on the hearts before her. Margaret Harrison, who had lost her husband James, sat with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. When Harper finished, Margaret spoke softly. "I always imagined looking into their eyes in a courtroom, watching them hear the sentence. I wanted that. But now," she shook her head, "now I just feel empty. They lived free while we carried this." Michael Peterson, son of William Peterson, leaned forward. He had been just a boy when his father disappeared. So they worked as a nurse and a bookkeeper. They went to church. They smiled at neighbors while we buried nothing but memories. His voice cracked. "Where's the justice in that?" Robert Johnson's brother, now a retired detective himself, couldn't speak at first. When Harper showed him photographs of Susan Mitchell's Tucson apartment, he broke down. On one wall calendar, a red X marked the date of his brother's death. After decades, he finally saw proof that the killers had remembered too, that his brother's murder was not forgotten but enshrined in their ritual. Harper knew the truth would never feel like enough, but she also knew the sisters' greatest weapon had been control, deciding when to appear, when to vanish, when to let the world remember them. Now that control was stripped away. She convinced the families to release the full story publicly, no secrets, no censorship. At a press conference, she declared, "The Crowley sisters do not get the last word. Their crimes belong to history, but their victims belong to the families. This case ends not on their terms but on ours." That autumn, in October 2014, a memorial was held in Chicago. For the first time, all 9 victims' names were read aloud together. A plaque was unveiled, etched with their names and the words, "No longer forgotten." Sheriff Dawson's widow attended, carrying with her a folder of his handwritten notes. Walter never stopped thinking about this case, she told the families. He would be proud to know you finally have answers. Back in Pine Grove, the police department unveiled a permanent display. The original fingerprint cards alongside modern digital scans, the rusted typewriter reports beside sleek forensic databases. It was a living reminder of how far science had come and how persistence, even across generations, could pierce through silence. For Harper, it was bittersweet. She had solved the mystery, yes, but justice had slipped through her fingers. The Crowley sisters had died in their beds, not in prison. The courtroom confrontation the families had imagined for decades would never come. And yet, in the photographs of that October memorial tears embraces, the reading of names, there was something like victory. Not the sharp justice of a verdict, but the quieter justice of truth at last spoken aloud. The story of Elizabeth and Catherine Crowley no longer belonged to them. It belonged to those who had suffered, those who had waited, those who had never stopped asking the questions. The autumn memorial in Chicago was not an ending. It was a beginning. Out of grief, the families built something that would outlast the Crowley sisters' silence. Together, they founded a non-profit dedicated to supporting families of unsolved murders and funding cold case investigations. Their first project was modest but symbolic, digitizing boxes of aging files from the 1,970 and 1,980, ensuring that no other evidence would rot away in basements as theirs once had. For Michael Peterson, whose father had been taken before he could even form memories, advocacy became a calling. He spoke before police academies, reminding recruits that behind every case number was a family living in limbo. My father became a file in a drawer, he would tell them. Don't ever forget that someone is still waiting on the other side. Robert Johnson's brother, who had spent his career searching for what others had missed, retired knowing at last that the truth had surfaced. For him, the revelation was both bitter and sweet. The killers never punished, but also never victorious. Their story, once their secret, had been taken back. In Pine Grove, the Willamette River bend where the first torso surfaced was renamed Memorial Park. A small stone monument listed the 9 victims by name. On certain summer evenings, older residents could be found sitting quietly on the benches, staring at the water, remembering the terror that had once gripped their town. The river, once a stage for horror, had become a place of remembrance. The Pine Grove Police Department created a permanent exhibit, placing the yellowed fingerprint cards beside the glowing screens of modern databases. On one display board, photographs of the sisters in 1976, smiling, beautiful, dressed in pale blue, were set beside images of them decades later in Tucson. Gray hair, glasses, weight gained, faces hardened, proof that time catches everyone, even monsters. Detective Marion Harper kept a photograph on her desk. The battered cardboard evidence boxes from 1976 stacked beside the sleek laptops of her cold case unit in 2014. This is the bridge, she told her team, between the past and the present, between failure and possibility. For Harper, the lesson was clear. Cold cases aren't dead, they're waiting. The Crowley sisters themselves had wanted to control their story. They left tapes, notebooks, manifestos, choosing their moment, crafting their narrative. But in the end, history refused to obey them. The narrative belonged to the victims, to the families, and to the truth. True crime authors, documentarians, and podcasters would dissect the case in years to come. Some lingered on the horror of the mutilations. Others studied the sisters' twisted logic, their hatred born of abuse. Psychologists pointed to the cycle of violence, daughters brutalized by a father, transforming into predators themselves. But no matter the angle, one fact remained. They had escaped courtrooms, but not history. In Pine Grove, people still talk about the summer of 1976, about the cream-colored Cadillac that pulled into the inn's gravel lot, about the 2 women in matching dresses, smiling as if they had nothing to hide. Older residents tell it to the young as a warning. Evil doesn't always look like evil. Sometimes it looks polite, clean, even beautiful. The Crowley sisters believed they had written their own final chapter, that by vanishing into new lives they had silenced the world forever. But the box from Tucson, the tape, the notebook, and the relentless pursuit of investigators like Dawson and Harper proved them wrong. Justice did not come in handcuffs or trials, it came in memory, in truth, in the refusal to forget. As Harper wrote in the final line of her report, the Crowley sisters escaped the courtroom, but they did not escape history. Their crimes and their victims will be remembered. In that remembrance lies the only justice that time could deliver. And so the story closes not with the slam of a prison door, but with the echo of names carved into stone, whispered by families, carried by rivers, and remembered by history itself.